Never speak unless spoken to. Picture a vast candlelit hall in a noble estate, stone walls echoing with footsteps, banners fluttering from ancient rafters, the air alive with quiet tension. It is the world of medieval and early modern Europe, where hierarchy is absolute, and power is measured not just by wealth or blood, but by silence. In this world, servants and nobles do not merely occupy different rooms, they exist in different universes, separated by invisible but unbreakable rules. The first and most sacred: never speak unless spoken to. To serve in a great house was to disappear in plain sight. Servants moved like shadows, cleaning, polishing, carrying trays, lighting fires, never daring to draw the eye. If a noble entered a room, every servant lowered their gaze and pressed themselves against the wall. To make a sound, to meet a master's eye, to utter a word not invited, was an act of unthinkable arrogance. It was not just custom, but law. House manuals from the 15th and 16th centuries spell it out in ink. Let no servant address his betters unless so bidden. The penalty for disobedience was severe: public scolding, beating, dismissal, or worse. In some households, the rules extended even to glances. A maid caught looking bold at a young lord might be whipped or sent away with her wages docked. This was not about etiquette. It was about control. Silence was a weapon. Nobles claimed it preserved dignity, but what it really preserved was distance and power. To deny a servant's voice was to remind them every moment that they belonged to another's world, and that world was closed to them. A servant's thoughts, jokes, fears, and joys had no place in the great hall. Consider the story of Thomas, a page boy barely 12 years old, whose whole world was the rhythm of duty, rising before dawn, running errands, enduring the endless drills of deference. One afternoon, a visiting lord, a distant cousin of the master, arrived at the estate. As Thomas hurried through the corridor, nerves jangling, he saw the lord ahead. Wanting to be polite, perhaps just to prove his worth, Thomas greeted him with a shy, "Good day, my lord." The words seemed harmless, even kind. But the visiting noble froze, his face twisting with offense. He reported Thomas immediately for insolent familiarity. That very evening, in full view of the other servants, Thomas was whipped, each lash a lesson in humility, and dismissed before he could even collect his few belongings. No reference, no mercy. His future, in that moment, was shattered for one innocent sentence. Why such cruelty? In the eyes of the ruling class, every word from below threatened the order of the world. A servant who spoke unbidden might one day question a command, resist an injustice, or, worst of all, forget their place. The punishment was not just for Thomas, but for all who watched, a reminder that the master's voice was the only one that mattered. The silence extended far beyond the halls. In the kitchen, the stables, the servants' quarters, the fear of speaking out bred a culture of whisper and rumor. Stories and warnings passed in the dark. Coded glances carried secret sympathies. For many, the inability to speak was a wound that never healed. In letters, diaries, and hidden records, some servants later recalled the suffocating loneliness, the sense of erasure. One wrote, "We were as ghosts, heard but never seen, always present but never known." Sometimes, nobles broke the rule themselves, testing the boundaries of power. A master might suddenly address a servant, forcing them to respond on the spot, judging not just their words, but their accent, their wit, their subservience. Even a correct answer could invite punishment if it was delivered with the wrong tone. In this way, language became a trap, conversation a kind of trial. Not all endured in silence. In the great upheavals of the 18th and 19th centuries, as revolutions toppled thrones and new ideas of equality spread, servants began to push back, sometimes with subtle acts of resistance, sometimes with open rebellion. In country manors and city townhouses, the right to speak became a symbol of dignity denied, but for every voice that finally rose, there were countless others lost to history. Servants who suffered in silence, their stories carried away by time. What does it mean to be forbidden to speak? To live in a world where your words are punishable, your presence barely acknowledged? For many, it meant more than humiliation. It meant never having the chance to share a thought, to offer comfort, to defend oneself, or simply to be known as a human being. It meant learning to silence your own voice, even when you were alone. So, next time you see a grand old house, imagine not just the laughter and music in the halls, but the silent army of invisible workers, the ones who never dared to speak unless spoken to, who learned every day that their worth was measured in silence. Remember Thomas, the page boy who lost everything for a single kind word. And remember that history's greatest cruelty is often not violence, but the denial of a voice. Don't ever make eye contact. There are rules so ancient, so invisible, that most who live under them never question their existence, until someone, by accident or desperation, breaks them. In medieval England, power was measured not only in land or coin, but in 1,000 silent gestures. Who could walk through which door? Who could speak first? Who could raise their eyes in the presence of their betters? To look directly into the face of one's master or mistress was not just rude, it was an act of rebellion. To stare was to claim equality. And in 1311, in a cold manor in Norfolk, one maid's gaze brought punishment swift and brutal, reminding all who witnessed it that the world had its place, and would defend it with violence. Step back for a moment into the halls and kitchens of 14th century England. Society was a pyramid, broad at the base and razor-sharp at the tip. Lords and ladies moved through their domains like minor gods. Their servants, laborers, and peasants hovered at the edge of visibility. Everything, the clothes you wore, the food you ate, the way you spoke, marked your station. But nothing revealed your place more sharply than your eyes. The act of looking directly at a master's face was known as presumptuous regard, a phrase that appears in court rolls, sermons, and even poems of the era. It was believed that only equals or superiors could meet another's gaze without insult. For the rest, the rule was simple. Look down, keep your eyes lowered, show humility in every gesture. The consequence of forgetting this law, even for a moment, could be severe. So it was for Anne, a young maid in the Norfolk household of Lady Edris. Anne was not born to servitude. She had grown up in a tenant's cottage, her parents lost to a fever that swept the village when she was barely old enough to carry water. Taken in by distant kin, sent to the manor for work, she learned quickly that life was measured in silent endurance, cold feet on flagstones, endless scrubbing, the quiet ache of hunger held behind a polite smile. Lady Edris was known for her piety and her pride. She expected her servants to be invisible, efficient, and above all, obedient. On the morning in question, a damp day in early spring, Anne was summoned to the solar to help dress her mistress for a visit from neighboring gentry. Anne's task was simple: hold the mirror, lace the gown, keep quiet unless spoken to. As Lady Edris fussed over her jewels, Anne, exhausted, anxious, perhaps only trying to anticipate her mistress's needs, looked up, searching her face for a sign of approval or further command. That moment was enough. Lady Edris caught Anne's gaze in the polished silver of the mirror. Silence fell, sharp as a blade. Lady Edris turned, her eyes cold with outrage. "You will not stare at me as though we are equals," she hissed. "Avert your eyes, girl. Do you think yourself my match?" Anne stammered an apology, bowing her head, but the damage was done. The mistress struck her with the back of her hand, the ring catching Anne's cheek. Blood welled instantly. But Lady Edris was not finished. She summoned the steward, her voice carrying through the hall, and ordered that Anne be disciplined for staring like an equal. The punishment was both public and savage. Anne was dragged into the courtyard, her wrists bound. In full view of the household, she was beaten with a rod. Each blow meant not only to wound her flesh, but to break any spirit that might rise in a servant's breast. The other maids and boys watched, silent and stricken. Some looked away, others dared not. The message was clear: never forget your place, and never, ever, presume to meet the eyes of your betters. Anne's injuries healed in time, but her spirit did not. She became quieter, more careful, her gaze always fixed on the floor, her hands trembling when summoned. In the years that followed, she would be just one of thousands of servants punished for imagined acts of insolence, for gestures that hinted at equality in a world built on hierarchy. The rule of averted eyes endured for centuries. Manuals of household management written for the gentry and merchant class instructed mistresses to watch for the impertinence of servants' eyes, warning that defiance often began with a stare. Court records from England, France, and beyond document dozens of cases where maids, stable boys, even children were beaten or dismissed for the crime of eye contact. It was an offense that could brand a servant as dangerous, unruly, even subversive. fit only for dismissal or worse. Why was eye contact so powerful? In a world obsessed with order, it was a language all its own. To look up was to say, I see you and you must see me. It was to demand acknowledgement as a person, not just a tool. Masters and mistresses guarded their authority by controlling not just the actions, but the very glances of those below them. For the powerful, being looked at by a servant felt like a threat, proof that the social wall between them and us was thinner than they wanted to believe. But Anne's story is also a reminder of resilience. Even in the face of humiliation, people remember. The servants of Norfolk whispered about the beating for years, passing the story from kitchen to kitchen, from mother to daughter. Some took it as a warning, others as a quiet invitation to resistance. An argument, perhaps, that every now and then the only dignity left is to look up, to meet the gaze of the world, even knowing the price. Today, we look back on such rules with disbelief, but the echoes remain. In the ways we treat those who serve, in the lines we draw between us and them, in the unspoken rules of who gets to be seen and who must look away. In every society, there are still forbidden glances, still silent punishments for those who dare to look up and say, without words, I am here, I exist. Anne's story, pulled from the margins of medieval court records, is more than a tale of cruelty. It is a window into the daily workings of power, the ways the smallest act can ripple into history, and the unbreakable truth that the desire to be seen is as old as humanity itself. So the next time you meet someone's eyes across a barrier of class, status, or expectation, remember Anne. Remember that sometimes defiance begins with nothing more than a glance, and sometimes that's enough to shake the world. Bow before entering every room. Imagine a world where every doorway is a test, every threshold a ritual of submission, where the simple act of entering a room is weighted with the invisible gravity of centuries. Hierarchy made flesh and bone. This was the world of servants in noble households across Europe for hundreds of years, a world where to forget the smallest gesture could mean humiliation, punishment, or the slow erasure of your own self. At the center of this social machinery was a simple but unforgiving rule: bow before entering every room. It was a gesture that seemed so slight, just a bow, a dip of the head, a flex at the waist. But for those who lived beneath the ceilings of castles, manors, and great townhouses, it was the dividing line between belonging and exile. Whether you were a kitchen maid, a footman, or a scullery boy barely old enough to tie your apron, you learned from your first day that your body was no longer your own. The house had rhythms, customs, and expectations as strict as any military order. The bow was its drumbeat. Picture a winter morning, the sun barely a rumor behind icy windows, as a servant hurries through echoing corridors with a heavy jug of water. Her arms ache from the weight. She knows the master's chamber is waiting, a fire to be tended, clothes to be set out, shoes to be polished before he stirs. But just as she reaches the door, she must pause. Even with hands full, even as steam rises from the jug and water sloshes dangerously close to the rim, she must bow. A too hasty nod is an insult. Too deep a bow, and the jug might slip or her back might spasm. But there is no margin for error. If the ritual is forgotten or performed carelessly, it is not just her pride at stake. It is her position, her reputation, her very place in the household. Noble houses ran on rules like these, codified in manuals, whispered in training, enforced by stewards and senior staff. Bowing was not just about deference. It was about constant awareness, reminding servants with every entrance of their lower station. A servant who forgot to bow, who entered a chamber upright and unbowed, risked more than a scolding. It was an act of dishonor, a sign that the delicate machinery of respect and authority had slipped. In some houses, a first offense brought a sharp rebuke, a public reminder in front of the other servants. Repeat offenses could mean lost privileges, lost wages, or even dismissal. And still, the work never stopped. There were jugs of water to carry, trays of food hot from the kitchen, coals glowing with dangerous heat. Even in the busiest moments, bowing could not be skipped. Imagine the terror of balancing a basket of linens or a tray stacked high with porcelain and pausing, mid-stride, muscles trembling, to perform the ritual. In winter, with cold making fingers stiff and numb, the risk of dropping or spilling was real. There are stories and household records of broken plates, scorched fingers, and shoes ruined by spilled wine, all trace back to the moment when Boeing collided with the relentless pace of labor. But the ritual was not only physical, it was psychological, a lesson repeated every day. You do not belong here as yourself, only as a servant. The bow was a sign that the master's space was sacred, that even air and light had to be approached with humility. It reminded everyone, servants and nobles alike, of the fragile peace maintained by strict roles. To bow was to shrink, to disappear a little, to accept invisibility as a condition of survival. Some houses went further. The most rigid noble families developed elaborate systems for signaling a servant's arrival: knocks, bells, whispered announcements, each culminating in the required bow. Even behind closed doors, a servant would bow before entering, as if the walls themselves demanded respect. The ritual was so deeply ingrained that former servants, long after leaving service, sometimes found themselves bowing before crossing into any new room, their bodies shaped by years of habit and anxiety. Children growing up in service learned the bow almost before they learned to speak. The tiniest mistake, forgetting to bow before an empty room or bowing in the wrong direction, could bring swift correction. Older servants policed the ritual as fiercely as any master, knowing that the whole household's reputation rested on these moments. To serve well was to vanish, to anticipate, to bow. For the nobles, the ritual was confirmation of their status, a subtle performance of power. To see a servant pause, even when burdened or exhausted, was to feel the old world order reassert itself. Sometimes, nobles tested their staff, waiting for a forgotten bow, savoring the discomfort it caused, using it as a pretext for a lesson in humility. In letters and diaries, aristocrats wrote about the pleasure of being obeyed, the assurance of respect paid in gestures as old as the manner itself. Yet, beneath the surface, the bow was a source of tension and quiet resistance. Servants learned to resent the daily humiliations, to grumble in the kitchens about the old goat's obsession with bowing. There were stories of subtle sabotage, servants bowing so low that they made a spectacle, or bowing to empty chairs as a quiet act of mockery. Some households, over time, relaxed the rules, recognizing that the most skilled staff were those allowed a shred of dignity. Others clung to the ritual, insisting it was the only thing separating them from the chaos of the outside world. The consequences of forgetting to bow were not always written down, but they lingered in the fear that haunted every servant's day. A scullery maid dismissed for impertinence might never find work again. A footman who blundered before a guest could see his wages docked, his prospects ruined. For many, the ritual became a kind of second skin, painful, awkward, but impossible to shed. Today, the world of bowing servants has vanished, consigned to dusty manuals and fading memories. But echoes of that old ritual survive, in the deference shown in boardrooms and palaces, in the small bows and nods we offer those in power, even when our hands are full and our backs are aching. The doorway is still a threshold, a place where the past weighs heavy, and every entrance carries a shadow of those who bowed before us. So, next time you pass through a doorway without thought, remember the servant with the heavy jug, the coals burning her hands, the terror of forgetting. Remember the world built on rituals of submission and the cost paid, day after day, by those whose only rebellion was the hope of standing tall. In every bow there is a story of survival, of discipline, of longing to be seen as more than the sum of your labor. In every bow, the hidden weight of history. You eat only after everyone else. In the grand halls of medieval castles and manors, where feasts dazzled the eye and the scent of roasting meats drifted through gilded chambers, there was another reality, a world hidden in the shadows, lived by those who served, those whose hands set the table, but who rarely tasted its bounty. For the vast armies of servants who kept these great houses running, the promise of a meal was not a right, but a privilege. And often, it was a privilege barely worthy of the name. It is easy, in looking back at history, to be seduced by the spectacle, the lavish spreads, golden goblets, platters piled high with venison, pies, bread, and fruit. The banquets of Europe's elite were carefully orchestrated affairs, designed as much for politics and power as for pleasure. Nobles and guests sat at the high table, their positions dictated by rank, their every need attended to by a silent cadre of footmen, maids, cooks, and pages. But as the laughter swelled and the wine flowed, there was another kind of anticipation humming through the stone corridors, a hunger born not of gluttony, but of anxious necessity. For servants, food was both work and hope. The process began hours before the first guest arrived, with kitchens waking before dawn, fires stoked, animals slaughtered, vegetables peeled and sorted, and loaves set to rise. The smells of baking and roasting filled the lower halls long before any noble lifted a fork. Yet the hands that created these feasts did so on empty stomachs, forbidden to nibble, their eyes fixed on the clock, and the growl in their bellies muffled by duty and fear. When the call to serve echoed through the halls, servants moved in a practiced dance, weaving platters through crowded rooms, pouring wine, slicing bread, refilling trenchers. They stood behind chairs, invisible but ever vigilant, ready to fetch a forgotten sauce or clean up a spilled goblet. Their attention was absolute. For any mistake, any sign of distraction, any hand caught sneaking a crust, could mean punishment, dismissal, or worse. In some houses, servants were even required to face the wall or keep their heads bowed as they waited, denied the comfort of a glance at the feasting they had made possible. And then, when the meal was over, when the nobles had eaten their fill and the air was thick with the scent of grease and spilled wine, came the moment of reckoning. The leftovers, if any, were the servants' share. But leftovers is a generous term. In the strictest households, servants might receive only cold, watery gruel ladled into chipped bowls, or scraps swept from platters onto trenchers. Stale slabs of bread used as plates and then tossed aside, soaked with gravy and grease, sometimes half chewed or gnawed to the bone. If a feast was especially generous, there might be fragments of meat or fruit, or a pie crust to share among many. But in leaner times, or under especially strict masters, even this could be withheld, with every edible morsel reserved for the family or sent to favored guests as tokens of goodwill. To eat after everyone else was not simply an inconvenience. It was a system that reinforced the hierarchy of the house. Servants ate late, after their duties were done, often in the cold kitchens or cramped servant halls, by candlelight or nothing at all. Their meals were rushed, consumed in near silence, always with one ear tuned for the sound of a bell or a master's call. There was never enough, and what there was rarely resembled the bounty that had just graced the high table. Leftovers themselves were a form of currency. Senior servants, stewards, butlers, cooks, often claimed the choicest scraps for themselves, distributing what remained to the lower ranks. In some houses, there was an entire system for dividing leftovers. The grosses, or larger bones and joints, went to the highest-ranking servants, while the crumbs, literally the small bits of bread and cheese, were left for the youngest or most junior. Sometimes, the poorest of the staff were permitted to gather in the kitchen after hours, hoping for a few spoonfuls of broth or the dregs of a pudding pot. And yet, even this meager arrangement was seen as a privilege. To be a servant in a great house was, for many, a step above the raw hunger of the streets. In rural villages and city slums, food was never guaranteed. Servants at least had the hope of a daily meal, however sparse. The reality, though, was that malnutrition was rampant. Chronic hunger led to stunted growth, weakness, and illness. Children entered service at 10 or 12 already thin, and many never regained the weight lost in their earliest years of labor. Rickets, scurvy, and anemia stalked the servant halls as surely as exhaustion and cold. There were moments of kindness, to be sure. A sympathetic cook might slip a maid an extra crust, or a generous mistress might order sweetmeats sent down to the kitchen on a holiday. But these were exceptions, remembered not because they were common, but because they stood out in a sea of routine deprivation. For servants, mealtime was both a reward and a reminder. It was the reward for a day's hard work, and the reminder of their place, last to eat, last to rest, last in every line of comfort and care. The leftovers they consumed were more than just food. They were the tangible evidence of the world's divisions, proof that some were born to plenty and others to the crumbs. And so, as the candles guttered and the great halls fell silent, servants gathered in their own shadowed corners, breaking bread with hands that had prepared 100 loaves, sharing meat they would never taste fresh, and dreaming of a world where hunger was not a sentence, but a memory. History remembers the feasts, the glimmering tables, the laughter of nobles, the triumph of abundance. But the truth is that every great house was built on the labor and hunger of those who served it, who waited their turn in patience and in silence, hoping for a scrap, a kindness, or simply enough to see them through another day. To eat only after everyone else was more than a custom. It was a law, written in hunger and hierarchy, and enforced not just by masters, but by the world itself. And in the echo of empty plates, the story of the servant's meal remains, a testament to endurance, humility, and the quiet strength of those who bore history's burdens, bite by bite, in the shadows of the feast. Don't be taller than your master. In the grand halls and smoky chambers of medieval Europe, the rules of power were written not only in ink, but in posture, in silence, and in the very height of a man's body. Among the tapestry of odd customs that shaped the lives of servants and masters, none was stranger or more quietly humiliating than the unwritten law. Don't be taller than your master. To modern ears, it sounds absurd, but for the men and boys who toiled below the banners and crests of the nobility, it was a rule enforced with the cold logic of fear and the delicate machinery of pride. It was an age when the household was a world unto itself, a miniature court with its own hierarchies, its own politics, its own rituals of deference and command. Servants came from villages and cities, recruited for strength or skill, sometimes for nothing more than desperation. Tall, sturdy young men were in high demand for heavy labor, for lifting casks, for bearing messages across muddy roads. But once inside the manor or castle, their very stature could become a liability, a danger to the invisible but all-important dignity of their lord. The expectation was clear, though rarely put into writing. If your master was short, you must make yourself smaller. If he entered a room, you were to stand aside, head bowed, or, if you were so unfortunate as to tower over him, to crouch, stoop, or even sit on a stool when in his presence. The humiliation was the point, a visible reminder that in this world, the body was not your own. Your place was not marked by birth or merit, but by your willingness to disappear, to fold yourself into invisibility whenever power walked past. Stories of this peculiar etiquette surface in household manuals and letters from the period. In one estate ledger from the 17th century, a footman is reprimanded for standing too tall in the solar, his shadow falling across the embroidered shoes of his mistress. In another, a cook is demoted after guests whispered that he looked down upon the head of the table. But the most infamous account comes from a great house in northern England, where a young man named Thomas, broad-shouldered with the misfortune to be 6 inches taller than his lord, was dismissed after being accused of towering above the dignity of the room. Thomas had come to service from a farming village, his height an advantage in the fields. The steward liked his work, but the master, short and quick-tempered, bristled every time Thomas poured his wine or bent to stoke the fire. Eventually, guests began to notice. The laughter was quiet, but the message was clear. How could a man rule his household if his own servant eclipsed him? In one chilling entry, the master writes, "The order of the house must be kept. I will not be diminished in mine own hall." Thomas was let go that winter, sent back to his village with a warning never to outgrow his place. The consequences of such a dismissal were severe. A servant's reputation followed him. To be sent away for offending a master's dignity could mean years of poverty or wandering. But for those who remained, the lesson was learned early and hard. Young pages were taught to bend their knees, to walk a step behind, to avoid meeting the master's eye. In the great houses of France, servants would sometimes kneel as the lord passed, a sea of bowed heads and bent spines reflecting the rigid social order of the age. The fear of being too tall extended beyond height. It was a metaphor for ambition, for any sign that a servant might overstep the boundaries of his station. To speak too loudly, to offer advice unasked, to be noticed for anything but obedience. These were all forms of towering, and all could be punished. In this world, power was maintained by shrinking others, by making their very bodies complicit in their own subjugation. And yet, there are glimpses of quiet rebellion. Letters and diaries from the era occasionally mention servants who, out of stubbornness or pride, refused to bend, who stood tall even as they were scolded, who left service rather than bow too low. Some lords tolerated it, seeing strength where others saw insolence. Others crushed it swiftly, fearing that even the suggestion of equality could unravel the fragile web of order that held their world together. In time, these customs faded, eroded by revolutions, reforms, and the slow march of modernity. But the echoes remain, a reminder of how power can be measured in inches, in gestures, in the silent ways we are taught to make ourselves smaller for the comfort of others. The tall servant forced to crouch is a symbol, not just of a forgotten age, but but of every moment when the powerful have demanded humility, not from virtue, but from fear. Today, the stories of men like Thomas survive only in footnotes, in faded ledgers, in the folklore of old country houses. Yet, they whisper a warning that dignity, once diminished, is not easily reclaimed, that the height of a man is not measured in inches, but in the courage to stand upright, even when the world expects you to shrink. The Master's Hall is empty now, the banners rotted away, the rules dissolved, but the lesson lingers in the shadows and the silence, wherever pride and fear still collide. No shoes in the Lord's bedroom. Step quietly, and picture yourself as a servant in a grand English manner, the sort with gilded mirrors, endless staircases, and rules so precise that a single mistake can haunt you forever. You rise in darkness, move like a ghost through the corridors, and rehearse every gesture, every silence. Among the strictest commands is one you never question. Never, under any circumstance, enter the master's or lady's bedchamber with shoes on your feet. It sounds almost quaint to us now, but to a servant in the 18th or 19th century, this rule was sacred, a line that separated not just cleanliness from dirt, but privilege from humiliation. The reason was simple and strictly enforced. The bedchamber's floor was covered with rushes, sweet-smelling reeds or straw mats, which soaked up the cold and perfume of the night, and which marked the space as private, sacred, and, above all, clean. Shoes, with their mud and filth from kitchens and stables, threatened to spoil the sanctity of this inner sanctum. So every day, before entering with a jug of water or a tray of food, you'd slip off your shoes at the threshold and walk in stockinged feet, heart pounding, alert for the slightest misstep. You might balance heavy silver, careful not to spill a drop. You might carry firewood, or help lay out a dressing gown. All the while, you are keenly aware that any trace of dirt, any stray footprint, could expose you as careless, disrespectful, unworthy. Punishments for a mistake were swift and cruel, designed less to correct and more to humiliate. If a servant was caught entering the Lord's bedroom shod, or if a scuff of mud marred the delicate rushes, there was no quiet scolding. Instead, the error became a lesson for all. A line of servants would be summoned, and the guilty party forced to stand in front of them, while the housekeeper or even the master himself enumerated the offense. "If you bring the street into the chamber, you bring shame to this house," they might declare. The culprit might be forced to clean the entire floor on their knees, apologize in front of peers, or even forfeit a month's wages. For some, the fear of humiliation was worse than any physical punishment. A single mistake could stain a reputation for years, making advancement impossible. Stories survive in letters and memoirs of young maids whose careers were derailed by a muddy footprint, or of old retainers who wept at the thought of being called careless after decades of loyal service. Even worse was the threat of dismissal. One slip in the wrong room, and a servant might find themselves out on the street by sundown, with no reference, no hope of finding work elsewhere. But beneath this ritual lay deeper truths about power and class. The bedroom, more than any other room, symbolized intimacy and privilege. To allow a servant to cross that threshold with shoes, the same shoes that trudged through muck, filth, and the rough world outside, would have been to invite the outside in, to blur the line between those who served and those who ruled. In this way, the rule was about more than just cleanliness. It was about reminding everyone of their place. The anxiety of these daily rituals left a mark on every servant's psyche. Imagine waking before dawn, nerves jangling, dreading that your stocking would slip, that your toes would stub against a hidden nail, or that you might drop the chamber pot you'd emptied 1,000 times before. Many servants practice the art of walking silently, heels never touching down, toes pointed forward, breaths held. Even outside the bedroom, you learn to move without sound, to become invisible, to erase your presence as much as possible. Some masters enjoyed catching their servants out, turning minor mistakes into grand spectacles. There are records of noblemen who laid deliberate traps, scattering a little dust, or moving a shoe rack to see if the staff were paying attention. A few mistresses, obsessed with purity, would check the rushes for stray specks, sometimes crawling on hands and knees in search of a single offending footprint. In these moments, the bedroom became a stage, and servants the actors, never knowing if applause or censure waited behind the curtain. Yet, in private diaries and letters, a different story emerges, one of pride, resilience, and even quiet rebellion. Some servants took fierce pride in their mastery of the rules, knowing that each day survived without humiliation was a triumph. Others whispered jokes about the absurdity of a world where the state of your stockings could decide your fate. A few, in moments of exhaustion or defiance, left a single muddy toe print at the edge of the rushes, a secret mark of resistance quickly swept away. Still, for most, the fear of public shame was ever present. Servants lived in a world where a whisper could undo a life, and every day brought the risk of a single misstep. The no shoes in the Lord's bedroom rule was just one of many, but it symbolized the larger reality, that those who served walked a path lined with traps, and that silence, invisibility, and endless caution were the price of survival. So, next time you visit a grand old manor, pause at the threshold of a bedroom. Imagine the countless feet, bare, cold, careful, that crossed it each morning, carrying burdens heavier than any tray. Remember the faces that flushed with shame for a single misstep, and the silent pride of those who walked invisible for years. History is built not only on grand gestures, but on the trembling, stockinged feet of those who served, quietly, carefully, always just a step away from disgrace. Don't show emotion in public. There are rules in every society that go unspoken, written not on paper but on faces and bodies, enforced not by law but by custom and threat. In the great houses of medieval and early modern Europe, one such rule reigned over every servant, child, and outsider who entered through the back door. Do not show emotion in public. Your feelings were not your own. They belonged to the household, to the hierarchy, to the silence that made the machinery of the manor run. And if you broke this rule, if you dared to make your pain or joy visible, the punishment was swift and brutal, a reminder that in this world, even your tears were not truly yours. The kitchens were the heart and furnace of every great house, hot, loud, and chaotic. They were staffed by the youngest, poorest, and least protected. Among these was Maria, a kitchen girl in a bustling manor somewhere in the Midlands, her real name lost to history, but her fate echoing through the centuries. Maria was 14, small for her age, her hands raw from endless scrubbing, her back bent from carrying water and hauling firewood. Her days started before dawn, when the hearth was little more than coals, and stretched until long after the household had eaten and gone to bed. She was invisible by design, valued only when she was silent, efficient, and unseen. One morning, in the rush to prepare the Lord's breakfast, Maria was sent to lift a heavy pot of boiling water from the fire. Her arms trembled, the pot slipped, and the scalding water splashed across her forearm. The pain was blinding, hot, immediate, impossible to ignore. Maria dropped the pot, clutching her arm, her eyes filling with tears before she even knew she was crying. The kitchen paused for a breath, the clatter of spoons and the hiss of the fire fading into silence as all eyes turned to the girl. But sympathy was not allowed to bloom. The chief cook, a woman made hard by decades of service, snapped, "No tears in my kitchen. We have work to do." Maria couldn't stop. The pain was too much, the fear too raw. The tears streamed down her cheeks, a low sob escaping her lips. That was all it took. The matron, summoned by the disturbance, stormed into the kitchen. She saw the mess, the weeping girl, and the frozen staff. Her judgment was instant. Maria was disrupting the peace. Crying, in this world, was more than a display of weakness. It was a crime against order, an offense to the dignity of the household. With a voice cold as stone, the matron ordered Maria to stand in the corner, hands behind her back, tears wiped away. For hours, Maria was kept apart, her burned arm untreated, her shame exposed to all. The lesson was not just for her, but for everyone watching. Emotion was private, invisible, and above all, forbidden in the presence of your betters. To suffer was to suffer in silence. This rule did not arise by accident. In a world where survival depended on hierarchy, any sign of vulnerability could be twisted into a weapon against you. Servants were expected to be machines, obedient, tireless, without hunger, exhaustion, or pain. Their smiles were to be offered only in service, their laughter suppressed, lest it be seen as insolence, their tears choked back lest they invite suspicion or scorn. Manuals of household conduct from the era warned mistresses to be alert for maudlin girls or sullen boys, insisting that any emotional display was a sign of laziness, deceit, or worse. Yet, The pressure to be silent was not just about discipline, it was about control. If servants wept or raged openly, it threatened the smooth operation of the household, challenged the myth that the Lord's domain was a place of peace and order. For the ruling class, emotion in the lower orders was dangerous, a reminder that those below might one day speak, or even rebel. For the servants themselves, it was a survival tactic. Never draw attention, never show pain, never give anyone a reason to single you out. But the cost was enormous. For girls like Maria, the pain of her scalded arm was compounded by humiliation, isolation, and the knowledge that her suffering mattered less than the appearance of calm. Stories like hers appear in the margins of old diaries and court records. A footman who was dismissed for laughing too loudly, a maid beaten for melancholy airs, a stable boy whipped for shouting after a kick from a horse. The message was always the same. Your feelings are dangerous, so you must hide them or be punished for them. And so, year after year, generation after generation, servants learned to mask their emotions behind carefully blank faces. Some grew cold, others bitter. A few learned to smile through tears. The kitchen, the scullery, the stable became schools in the art of invisibility. And yet, behind closed doors, in the tiny rooms where servants slept or whispered together at night, the real feelings would sometimes break through. Laughter muffled beneath blankets, grief shared in quiet voices, anger burning in the heart. Historians now see these stories as windows into a society obsessed with order and terrified of chaos. The household was a microcosm of the world outside, where only those at the top could afford the luxury of emotion. For everyone else, dignity was found not in expression, but in endurance. It was a world where silence became armor, and every uncried terror a secret victory over the powers that sought to erase you. Today, the rules have changed, but their shadows remain. In every workplace, every school, every institution where vulnerability is seen as a threat, Maria's story lingers. The kitchen girl who was punished for crying reminds us that the price of silence is sometimes too high, and that every tear shed in defiance is a small act of courage. So, the next time you are told to hide your pain, to smile when you want to scream, remember Maria. Remember the kitchens where silence reigned, and remember that to feel, to express, to be fully human is not a weakness, but a right stolen from so many for so long. Never touch the Lord's plate. Imagine a table gleaming beneath flickering candlelight, silver cutlery glinting like a line of tiny swords, and porcelain plates so thin they ring when tapped. The Lord of the manor sits at the head, ringed by family and honored guests, every gesture measured, every bite a performance. Yet, in this glittering world, an invisible line is drawn, a line no servant must ever cross. Never touch the Lord's plate, not with your bare hands, not even by accident, for the hands that scrubbed chamber pots and swept the stables could never be permitted to contaminate the sanctity of noble food. And to break this rule was not just a breach of etiquette, it could mean disgrace, dismissal, or, in rare cases, an accusation as severe as treason. This is not simply a story about table manners, it is a story about power, about the invisible rituals that bound servants to their masters, and the terrifying stakes behind every small gesture. Across medieval and early modern Europe, and into the grand houses of the 18th and 19th centuries, dining was an act of theater. The Lord's meal was both a spectacle and a declaration of his superiority, with every plate, goblet, and napkin signaling order in a world obsessed with hierarchy. The preparation for a noble meal began hours before the first dish was carried in. Servants scurried between kitchen and hall, hands red from scalding water, fingers cracked by cold, laboring not just to cook, but to cleanse. Everything that might touch a lord's food, platters, spoons, serving bowls, was scrubbed, boiled, polished to a mirror sheen. But the most delicate step remained, the serving itself. The rules were simple, absolute, and drilled into every new hire from their first day. Never, under any circumstance, should a servant's bare hand come into contact with the plate or the food it carried. To touch was to pollute, to leave a trace of one's own lowliness on the very thing that symbolized the master's place in the world. Instead, servants were taught to use implements, tongs for hot dishes, silver forks for carving, clean cloths to lift heavy lids. When passing plates, some houses required 2 layers of linen to ensure not even a ghost of a fingerprint was left behind. In the finest houses, rituals became almost absurdly elaborate. The butler, resplendent in livery, would demonstrate the correct technique, 2 fingers only on the rim, never touching the surface, always with a napkin in between. Footmen rehearsed the act of balancing heavy trays with one gloved hand, or of using ornate utensils to pass bread and cheese. Woe to the maid who forgot herself for a moment, who reached out to steady a wobbling dish, only to have her skin brush the Lord's plate. Even in the kitchens, the scullery maids spoke in hushed voices of the punishments handed down for such carelessness. Why such severity? Partly, it was about hygiene, a primitive, instinctive fear of contamination in an age before germs were understood. The hands of servants were seen as bearers of dirt, disease, and disorder. More deeply, it was about class, about erecting invisible barriers between those who ruled and those who served. The plate became a kind of sacred object, a boundary no commoner could cross. The consequences of breaking the rule varied from house to house, but they were always swift and humiliating. At best, a servant caught touching the plate would be reprimanded in front of the assembled guests, their shame displayed as a lesson to others. More often, they were dismissed without reference, a sentence to poverty, since no other household would hire someone known to be careless or disrespectful. In the strictest homes, rumors swirled of harsher punishments. Some lords, convinced that an enemy had tried to poison their food, would accuse a servant of treason for so much as a fingerprint out of place. Stories survive of servants thrown into cells, whipped, or even handed over to the magistrate on suspicion alone. These fears were not always irrational. Poisoning was a real threat in the high-stakes world of aristocratic power. A careless hand could be an assassin's tool, a servant's mistake, a potential cover for murder. Trust was as brittle as fine china. To this day, the most exclusive banquets maintain an army of invisible workers, each trained to observe the old codes, always gloved, always shielded by layers of ritual and linen, yet the rituals cut both ways. For servants, mastering these rules was both a burden and a mark of pride. The best butlers and housekeepers could serve 100 guests without so much as a smudge on a plate. Their skill was a kind of invisible armor, protecting them from the master's wrath and earning them grudging respect. In private, the servants mocked the excesses, whispering about plates too holy for mortal touch, inventing games to see who could polish a spoon to the brightest shine. But always beneath the humor was fear. To eat at a noble table was to be reminded with every mouthful of one's place in the world. The servants saw this most clearly, living their lives one step from disgrace. They learned to move silently, to keep their eyes lowered, to handle every object as if it were both priceless and dangerous. The anxiety of service seeped into every corner of the house. A dropped dish, a smudged rim, a hand that reached too far. At night, servants lay awake and replayed the day's mistakes, hoping they would not be summoned in the morning for a final reckoning. The old rules lingered long after the world began to change. As new ideas of equality crept into law and culture, the rituals of the Lord's table began to fade. Gloves were traded for bare hands, and the line between master and servant blurred. But still, in the oldest houses, there are those who remember the terror and pride that came from never touching the Lord's plate. Next time you set a table or serve a meal, think of the generations who came before, of the trembling hands, the hidden scars, the secret knowledge passed from one servant to the next. The ritual may have faded, but the story remains, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the heaviest weight, and the greatest dangers lie in the spaces we are forbidden to cross. Stay silent during prayers, even if you faint. In the frozen mornings of medieval and early modern Europe, when darkness still clung to castle walls and the breath of servants rose in pale clouds, a different sort of discipline ruled the first hours of the day. One written not in tools or tasks, but in silence. Or for the legions of household servants, chapel was not merely a spiritual obligation. It was a ritual of endurance, a test of loyalty, and a lesson in invisibility. The rules were simple and absolute. During Mass, you were to be seen, not heard, and never, ever draw attention to yourself, even if your body failed you. The reality of chapel duty was as grueling as any labor in the kitchens or fields. Most noble houses, monasteries, and even wealthy merchant manors maintained their own chapels, sometimes grand and echoing with stained glass and stone, sometimes little more than cold annexes, with drafty pews and bare altars. For servants, the experience was always the same, a command to kneel in neat rows, heads bowed, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the flagstones or the hem of a master's cloak. Winter made the ordeal brutal. Chapels, rarely heated, were bitterly cold, stone floors leaching warmth through thin shoes, icy drafts slipping beneath heavy doors, and breath turning to mist in the air. In such conditions, stillness was agony. Servants, already exhausted from rising before dawn, performing chores on empty stomachs, and snatching only moments of sleep between bell and bell, were expected to kneel for an hour, sometimes two, as the priest recited Latin prayers in a cadence that seemed designed to lull even the most devout into drowsiness. Fainting was common among the young, the weak, and the hungry, but the expectation remained: silence at all costs. The chapel was a stage for hierarchy as much as piety. Nobles and families sat or stood in comfort, swaddled in furs, close to the altar where the warmth of candles reached. Servants knelt in the back, sometimes pressed together for warmth, but more often left exposed, watched closely by stewards and chaplains. The message was unmistakable. Your suffering was both an offering and a reminder of your place. There are stories, scattered in the journals of the period, and the whispered memories of descendants that captured the chilling intensity of this expectation. One morning in the chapel of a great northern estate, a maid, no more than 16, pale from weeks of long hours and scant meals, began to sway as the prayers stretched on. Her head dipped, her arms trembled. Those nearest her dared not reach out. Aiding another was as forbidden as speaking out of turn. Then, with a soft thud, she crumpled to the stone floor, consciousness slipping away as her body yielded to exhaustion and cold. The reaction was not shock or compassion. The priest continued without pause. The household steward, his face unmoved, summoned 2 footmen, who entered, seized the girl beneath the arms, and dragged her limp form down the aisle, her shoes scraping the floor like the hooves of livestock bound for market. No one spoke her name. The doors shut again. The prayers resumed. In the servants' quarters, the aftermath was always the same. The fainted servant was berated for weakness, sometimes punished for disruption. Rarely was food or warmth provided as comfort. The lesson was clear. Your suffering is less than the sanctity of ritual, and your body, hungry, tired, freezing, was to be mastered, not pitied. A servant who collapsed might be reassigned to harder work, or, if the master's patience wore thin, sent away entirely. This ritual silence, so strictly enforced, became a weapon of control. It taught the lowest in the house that their pain must be hidden, that obedience was measured in endurance, and that even their prayers were not their own, but belonged to the order and spectacle of the household. For the noble families, this was discipline, an outward sign of order and piety. For the church, it was proof that all souls, no matter how lowly, were united in worship, even if some did so through gritted teeth and tears. Medical records from the era, where they survive, are full of the consequences. Servants developed chapel knees, raw, inflamed joints from kneeling on cold stone, sometimes leading to chronic pain and lameness. Cases of chilblains, frostbite, and fainting fits appear in the notes of parish doctors, though rarely linked to their true cause. Hunger, fatigue, and the relentless pressure to serve silently created a culture where physical collapse was routine but never acknowledged. Yet, in private moments, out of sight of stewards and priests, servants shared a different gospel, a solidarity born in whispered stories and small acts of kindness. A maid might slip a crust of bread to a friend after a long service. A stable boy, returning from Mass, would help carry a fainting girl to her cot, risking the wrath of his overseer. In these quiet rebellions, they built a community, invisible but resilient, that endured even as the system demanded their silence. For the masters, Mass was a source of pride and order. For the servants, it was an ordeal, sometimes spiritual, often physical, always a test of what the body and spirit could bear. The fainting of a servant was not a scandal, but a background detail in the grand tapestry of household life. And so, for centuries, kneeling in silence became the hidden heartbeat of the great houses, an act of worship, a ritual of control, and a reminder that in the coldest corners of history, even prayer could become a punishment. The next time you walk through the echoing halls of a historic chapel, picture the scene. Rows of servants, backs straight, lips sealed, bodies trembling not from piety, but from hunger and chill, each one silently bargaining with their own endurance. Stay upright, stay awake, stay silent, no matter what. Remember that behind every gilded altar and glowing stained glass, there are the untold stories of those who knelt in the shadows and paid for the privilege of prayer with their own pain. Don't sleep until the fire is dead. In the long, restless nights of the medieval manor, when the world outside was only blackness and wind, the heart of every household was the fire. Long before the glow of street lamps or the hum of modern heat, warmth meant survival, and survival meant vigilance. In this world, where a single spark could mean comfort or catastrophe, there was one rule every servant knew by heart. Don't sleep until the fire is dead. The great hearth was more than a place to cook or gather. It was a symbol of the house's life itself, a flickering guardian against the terrors of the dark. The day began and ended with the tending of flames. The first servant to rise coaxed the embers awake, and the last to sleep had to see them safely die. In between, the fire must never be allowed to rage out of control or fade too soon, for both disaster and disgrace waited in its embers. For the servants, this duty fell hardest on those lowest in the pecking order, the young, the new, the least favored. When the gentry retired, the guests grew silent, and the great doors were barred against the night. It was the responsibility of the scullion or underfootman to crouch by the ashes, poking and prodding the glowing coals, watching the tongues of flame gutter and shrink. Sometimes the fire took hours to die. Sometimes it refused, flaring up as if in protest, making a mockery of exhausted bodies and drooping eyes. In the dead of winter, the fire was both a comfort and a curse. The warmth was coveted, but the fear of what the fire could do, if left burning, if left unattended, haunted every household. An untended hearth could spark and spread, turning a manor into a funeral pyre. Ancient beams and thatched roofs were tinderboxes, and the memory of past disasters lingered in every whispered story of a rival family's ruin. So the rule was strict and absolute. No servant might rest until the embers had gone black and cold. The consequences of failure were swift and cruel. In some households, an overseer or senior servant would patrol the corridors long after midnight, checking each hearth with a stern eye. If they found a servant slumped beside the fire, snoring softly, they did not wake him with a gentle nudge. Instead, it was common to have a jug of cold water dashed over the offender's head, a shock that sent him gasping into full shivering consciousness. The shame of being discovered sleeping on duty was matched only by the physical discomfort and the mockery of fellow servants. In the worst cases, especially where a mistake led to smoldering embers rekindling or a near miss with disaster, the punishment was harsher still: immediate dismissal, a reputation stained, a home and livelihood lost with the sunrise. These were not idle threats. Stories abounded, passed from servant to servant in the shadows of the kitchen or the freezing attic rooms, of men and women cast out into the night for a single moment of weakness. The fate of a dismissed servant was bleak, wandering from house to house in search of work, often blacklisted by the network of gossipy housekeepers who kept strict accounts of every blunder. Sometimes the stories whispered of former servants who died of cold in the hedgerows, still haunted by the memory of that last fatal nap. Yet the rule was not just about fear. There was, buried in the ashes, a strange camaraderie. Servants left alone with the dying fire found themselves in a rare pocket of solitude, a time when the master's demands fell silent, when the rigid hierarchy of the day faded into the red glow of coals. Some wrote letters home in the warmth, risking a few lines before the light vanished. Others sang softly to themselves, or thought of better days, or simply watched the shapes dance in the flames, letting their mind drift where their body could not. Still, the pressure to stay awake was immense. In some great houses, servants devised their own tricks, pinching their arms, standing on one leg, sipping water, whispering prayers. The hours between midnight and dawn could feel like an eternity, and the temptation to rest just for a moment, just to close one's eyes, if only until the fire faded, was almost overwhelming. But always there was the fear of the overseer's footfall, of the cold water, of the cruel words, and the knowledge that the family's safety and one's own future rested on a thin line of glowing embers. Fire itself was never just a tool. It was both a friend and an enemy, a force to be worshipped and feared. Servants learned to read its moods, the hiss of sap in a new log, the slow collapse of charred wood, the sudden flare of a draft through the chimney. The hearth became their silent confessor, bearing witness to their exhaustion, their hopes, and their secret struggles. In that flickering light, every servant lived on the edge, between warmth and ruin, between duty and sleep. The world changed, but the memory of those long nights endures. Central heating and gas lamps arrived, and the servants' vigil at the hearth became a story for the fireside, a tale told with a shiver and a laugh, the cold water forgotten, the fear made distant. But in every echoing hall, in every manor that still stands, the ghosts of those who tended the last embers linger, their tired hands, their anxious hearts, their stubborn will to stay awake against all odds. They built the safety and comfort that others took for granted. So, remember, when you see a glowing hearth, that once upon a time it was the job of the most powerless to guard the flames until the very last flicker died. To sleep before the fire was dead was to risk all, to gamble with fear, with pride, with the thin, fragile thread that held a home together through the darkness. And for centuries, it was a gamble that could cost you everything. No gossip in the hallway. Imagine the long, stone corridors of a medieval English manor, echoing with the faint shuffle of feet and the distant clang of the kitchens. The walls are thick, the torches flicker, and every sound is magnified. A dropped spoon, a whispered word, a breath caught in fear. Servants glide through these halls like shadows, eyes averted, lips pressed thin, all too aware of the invisible lines drawn by power. Here, silence is not just safety, it is survival. And there is one rule that stands above all others: never gossip in the hallway. In this world, servants live close, sleeping in cramped quarters, sharing bread in shadowed corners, moving in silent, choreographed patterns through the estate. But while proximity breeds familiarity, it also brings danger. A careless comment, a snicker about a drunken lord, or a whispered story about a guest's indiscretion could travel farther than you ever intended, right into the ears of the master, his steward, or worse, a rival servant looking to curry favor. In the language of the time, sowing disrespect with tongues was more than a minor offense. It was a betrayal, a threat to the fragile fabric that kept the household together. The penalties were draconian. To be caught gossiping, especially about the affairs of your betters, could mean a public flogging, the docking of precious wages, or even expulsion. In 1423, at a grand estate in northern England, 3 grooms were accused of whispering in the hallway about the lord's drunkenness at a feast and the mysterious favor a young lady had shown a visiting knight. The steward, overhearing, wasted no time. The men were hauled before the whole household, stripped to the waist, and sentenced not just to a whipping, but to branding, a hot iron pressed to the flesh, marking them forever as traitors to their station. For the masters, gossip was not just disrespect, it was subversion. A rumor could undermine authority, spark dissent, or damage a noble reputation in ways swords could not. In a world built on hierarchy, where status was everything and scandal could ruin a family, words were weapons. The lords demanded obedience, but what they truly feared was the power of a servant's tongue to reveal secrets meant to stay behind closed doors. So, the great halls became theaters of fear and discipline. Stewards watched for conspiratorial glances, maids' laughter, stable boys huddled too close in the shadows. Manuals from the period, still preserved in faded ink, warned sternly, "Let no man or woman keep idle speech in passage, for the tongue is a thief that robs the house of peace." Suspicion was a constant companion, and servants learned to guard their words as jealously as a miser guards his gold. Yet, the silence was never perfect. The human need to speak, to share burdens and joys, could not be erased. In the privacy of attics, behind the heavy doors of servants' halls, or during late-night chores, stories still spilled out, coded, guarded, but persistent. The fear of punishment made every word heavier, every listener a potential enemy or ally. Some servants became legendary for their discretion, rising through the ranks on a reputation for silent loyalty. Others, reckless or naive, vanished from the estate overnight, their absence explained in whispers as an example to all. The branding of the 3 grooms in 1423 became infamous. For weeks, their wounds festered. For years, the scars marked them. Physical proof that even a fleeting moment of careless speech could cost a lifetime of pain. Some who witnessed the punishment never spoke of their masters again, locking their thoughts away behind blank faces and polite yes sirs. Others, embittered, carried tales to neighboring estates, where gossip thrived even more hungrily in the shadows. But why such terror over words? Because in the medieval mind, order was always one rumor away from collapse. Lords depended on the silence and complicity of those who served them. A single story, true or false, could spark jealousy, blackmail, or violence. The household was not just a place of work, but a stage upon which every servant's silence was part of the performance of power. As centuries passed, the rule softened but never disappeared. In the great houses of the Renaissance and beyond, new punishments emerged: fines, isolation, or simply being cast out without reference. But the memory of earlier brutalities lingered in every warning: speak not unless you wish to suffer. Even today, echoes of this fear shape the world of service. The expectation to see all, hear all, but never reveal anything that might upset the peace. So, next time you imagine the grandeur of a medieval manor, listen for the silences as much as the music and laughter. Picture the servants moving quietly through the corridors, every word measured, every joke swallowed, knowing that the walls themselves might be listening. And remember the three grooms whose only crime was a moment's laughter, a warning burned into flesh, and into the memory of a world where the wrong word in the wrong hallway could cost you everything. Don't be seen carrying waste. Every society draws invisible lines between what is seen and unseen, who is allowed to touch the world's dirt, and who must be shielded from even the hint of it. In the great houses of medieval and early modern Europe, nowhere was this division more literal or more strictly enforced than in the daily ritual of carrying waste. Human dignity for the lord and his family rested not just on fine clothes or polished manners, but on the illusion that filth never existed at all. For the servants, the rule was clear: never be seen carrying the chamber pot. To be caught with waste in hand was more than an embarrassment. It was a violation that could stain your reputation. And in a world built on hierarchy, even a moment's humiliation could change your life forever. Step into the back corridors of a grand manor, stone walls damp with centuries of use, narrow stairways hidden behind wooden panels, and tiny servants' doors leading to the world no guest was ever meant to see. Here, before dawn, the lowest-ranking maids moved silently, tasked with the job that no one else would touch, emptying the chamber pots of the family and their honored guests. There were pots for every bedchamber, every sick room, every visiting dignitary who passed through. Some were made of fine porcelain, painted with delicate flowers. Others were battered pewter or simple clay, cracked from years of use. All held the same secret burden. The unspoken law was simple: do your work in the dark before the household stirs, and above all, avoid being seen. Even a fleeting glimpse of a servant carrying waste could taint the dignity of the household, break the illusion that the great and the good lived somehow above the mess of flesh and appetite. Manuals for housekeepers warned, "Let not the gentlefolk see such offices performed, for it offends both nose and mind." The punishment for failing in this discretion was harsh. Maids who were spotted with chamber pots were often scolded, humiliated, or worse, reassigned to the dirtiest, lowest work available. The stables, muddy, smelly, and filled with danger, were the ultimate threat. Martha was one such maid, working in a manor on the edge of an English shire. She was 16, quick-witted, and careful, having learned the rules of invisibility from her first day. But in the world of endless corridors and unpredictable routines, even the most diligent servant could be caught off guard. One morning, just before sunrise, Martha hurried down a back stair with an ornate porcelain pot, her eyes on her feet, heart pounding with the hope of going unseen. But as she rounded a corner, the master himself appeared, up early, impatient, and wholly unprepared to see the realities of his own household. Their eyes met for a split second, and the silence that followed was thick with horror. Martha tried to avert her gaze, to blend into the shadows, but it was too late. The master's face twisted with disgust. Without a word, he turned on his heel and called for the housekeeper. Within the hour, Martha was summoned to the kitchen and given a scathing lecture. "You have shamed the house," the housekeeper said, voice sharp as a lash. "If the master wanted to see filth, he would look to the gutters, not his own halls. You will be sent to the stables." The stables were not a simple reassignment. They were in exile. There, Martha joined the ranks of stable boys and dung collectors, trading chamber pots for manure piles, delicate pots for splintered shovels. The message was clear to every other servant. No matter how necessary your work, you must remain invisible. If your labor threatens the dignity of those above, you are not only replaceable, but tainted. This system was more than just cruelty. It was a ritual of social control. By demanding that servants erase all evidence of bodily functions, the ruling class maintained not just their own comfort, but the fiction that they were something more than flesh and blood. The servants, meanwhile, learned to be ghosts, moving in silence, avoiding eye contact, mastering the art of disappearance. Chamber pots were carried wrapped in cloth, concealed in baskets, timed to avoid any encounter with their betters. To fail was to risk everything. Yet, even as the servants endured this humiliation, they also found quiet ways to reclaim their dignity. In the privacy of their quarters, they joked about the porcelain pots and the lengths to which the gentry went to ignore their own humanity. If only they emptied their own pots, Martha would say years later, they might remember they are just like the rest of us. Among the servants, these jokes were acts of resistance, small, vital reminders that the lines between clean and unclean were drawn not by nature, but by power. Historians today find traces of these rules in the household manuals, the letters of housekeepers, even the rare diaries of servants themselves. The obsession with keeping waste, and those who carried it, out of sight reflects the deep anxiety of an age obsessed with order, class, and the maintenance of appearances. For the poor, the penalty for being visible was always greatest. For the rich, the cost was ignorance, their lives built on invisible labor, their comfort maintained by the silence and skill of those they chose never to see. The world has changed, but the lesson endures. Every society draws lines between what can and cannot be shown, between those whose labor is celebrated and those whose work is meant to be forgotten. The story of Martha and the thousands like her reminds us that the boundaries of dignity are always being drawn and redrawn, not by nature, but by power, privilege, and the courage of those who refuse to be invisible. So next time you hear a door close softly behind you or pass through a corridor before dawn, remember the servants who moved in silence, carrying the burdens no one wanted to acknowledge. Their work built the world, and their stories, even when hidden, will always find a way to be seen. Don't ever leave your post. Picture the stone corridors of a medieval castle or the polished marble halls of a Georgian manor. Shadows flicker along the walls, footsteps echo in the distance, and somewhere in the hush of dawn or the hush of midnight, a single servant stands guard. The task might seem simple. Hold a torch in the corridor, watch the stable doors, stand by the main gate in all weather. But in the eyes of the master, this was a sacred trust. The rule was absolute. Don't ever leave your post. Not for hunger, not for fatigue, not for the pounding rain or the biting cold. To abandon your station, even for a moment, was to risk disgrace, punishment, or the end of your livelihood. For centuries, the smooth running of a noble household depended on dozens, sometimes hundreds of invisible hands, servants stationed in every room, every hallway, every corner of the estate. Each one had a precise role, drilled into them by years of training, custom, and fear. Some were visible, footmen at the entry, guards at the doors, stewards in the reception hall. Others worked in the shadows, a kitchen boy stirring the night fire, a stable hand watching the restless horses, a torchbearer waiting silently to light a guest's way in the dark. But all of them, from the highest steward to the youngest page, lived under the same unyielding command: never leave your post. In noble society, order and reputation were everything. The absence of a single guard could let in a thief, an assassin, or, worse, a rumor of negligence. The missing torchbearer could leave a guest stumbling in the dark, embarrassing the household and its name. Every station was a bulwark against chaos, every presence a silent promise that the master's world was under control. To enforce this rule, households developed intricate systems of oversight and discipline. Stewards paced the halls, checking posts at odd hours. Senior servants kept detailed records, noting who was at their station and for how long. Wages, privileges, and even a servant's future prospects depended on an unblemished record. Don't ever leave your post was not just advice. It was law, spoken and unspoken, reinforced every day through cautionary tales and visible punishment. One such story, preserved in the diary of a 17th century housekeeper, tells of a steward assigned to guard the main door during a violent storm. Rain battered the roof, thunder shook the windows, and the wind howled down the chimney. As the hours dragged on, water pooled at the threshold, soaking the steward's shoes and numbing his fingers. When the master finally passed by on his way to bed, he found the door unguarded and the steward shivering under a stone arch just outside, seeking shelter from the rain. The punishment was swift. A public reprimand at the next servant assembly and a week's wages docked for dereliction of duty. For most servants, the consequences could be far harsher. In great houses with dozens of staff, competition was fierce and mistakes rarely forgiven. Leaving your post, even for a moment, marked you as unreliable. It meant the next opening, a better post, higher pay, a chance to escape the worst chores, would go to someone else. In some cases, it meant dismissal, banishment from the only home you had, and the long, shameful trek to find work in another household that might never trust you. The rule's origins lay deep in the history of service, woven through both necessity and fear. Medieval castles needed constant vigilance. Bandits, fire, or rivals might strike at any time. Guards who abandoned their posts could doom an entire household. The tradition bled into peacetime. By the Georgian and Victorian eras, the threat was less about attack and more about reputation. No matter how refined the setting, a missing servant was a crack in the porcelain of order. The realities of this rule were grueling. A hallway torchbearer might stand for hours in silence, back straight, eyes forward, feet aching. He couldn't eat, sit, or even shift his weight without risking censure. If nature called, he held it. If his eyelids drooped, he pinched himself awake. In winter, the cold crept through stone floors. In summer, heat stifled the air. The task demanded endurance, not only of the body, but of the mind, a kind of discipline that wore down the will, shaping lives around the needs of others. Some posts were more dangerous than others. Stable hands kept watch through the night, their ears tuned to every restless snort and hoofbeat. Door guards braved storms, darkness, and the threat of trespassers. Even in lesser posts, the bell puller at the gate, the housemaid waiting for the mistress's ring. The penalty for absence was the same. Miss a moment, and you missed your chance to be trusted. For many servants, the rule became second nature, internalized so deeply that they felt guilt or panic at the thought of stepping away. Stories circulated among staff, of the butler who left his post to comfort a crying child, only to be dismissed. The maid who was caught napping in the linen room, never to be seen again. These cautionary tales ensured obedience, even when exhaustion set in or the work seemed pointless. Yet, as with so many rigid systems, cracks appeared. Servants developed quiet strategies to survive. An older footman might cover for a younger one in distress. Kitchen maids might signal each other to buy a moment's rest. Sometimes, a kind-hearted mistress or master would quietly forgive a slip, recognizing the humanity behind the uniform. But such mercy was rare. More often, the rule was enforced by other servants, who knew that one person's mistake could bring scrutiny and suffering upon them all. With time, the world of household service began to change. Mechanization, legal reform, and shifting social attitudes slowly loosened the grip of the old rules. But the legacy remained, a culture of discipline and vigilance, of pride and endurance, and fear of error, passed down through generations. The phrase, "don't ever leave your post," survived in the language of armies, police, even offices, a ghost of the era when the smooth running of the world depended on invisible people standing exactly where they were told, for as long as they were needed. Today, the great houses and castles may have become museums or luxury hotels, but the echoes of that old discipline remain. The next time you see a doorman at his post, a guard on duty, or a worker who never takes a break, remember the world they inherited. A world where a moment's absence could cost everything, and where to stand one's ground was not just a job, but a testament to survival. In every silent hallway, behind every polished door, the rule still whispers, "Don't ever leave your post." For centuries, it was the law of service, and for those who lived beneath its shadow, it shaped not only how they worked, but who they became. Serve with your left hand behind your back. In the gilded halls of England's great palaces, where kings dined beneath vaulted ceilings and the clink of silver was a daily music, The rituals of service were as strict and choreographed as any royal procession. Every action, from the angle of a poured wine to the direction a dish was presented, signaled rank, order, and absolute control. At the heart of these rituals was a rule that seems, to modern eyes, almost comical. A servant must keep their left hand behind their back at all times during table service. Yet, for those who lived beneath the gaze of monarchs, this rule was more than etiquette. It was a test, a symbol, and sometimes a sentence. The origins of the left hand behind the back custom are lost to time, but its purpose was clear. In the courts of Tudor, Stuart, and Georgian England, display was everything. The nobility demanded discipline and self-mastery from those who served them. Servants, often selected for their height, appearance, and grace, were expected to move like living furniture, elegant but invisible, precise but silent, capable of anticipating every need without betraying a flicker of emotion or fatigue. The left hand, considered unclean in ancient superstition and a sign of clumsiness in the world of service, was hidden to avoid any accidental contact with the tableware or worse, the noble diners. This posture also displayed the servant's restraint. With only one hand available, every movement had to be measured, deliberate, and almost balletic. Dropping so much as a spoon or a crumb could mark a servant as careless, an accusation that might mean a scolding, a fine, or even immediate dismissal. For the most prestigious tables, Windsor Castle, Hampton Court, and the private residences of the aristocracy, the pressure was unrelenting. The grand feasts and daily dinners of the royal court were not just meals, but theater. Foreign dignitaries, rival courtiers, and ambitious guests scrutinized every gesture for signs of weakness or fault. If a glass was filled too quickly or a plate presented with the wrong hand, it reflected badly not just on the servant, but on the entire household. Servants drilled for weeks, practicing with empty goblets and plates, perfecting the art of balancing heavy trays, carving fowl, or pouring wine with one hand steady and the other locked firmly behind their back. Fingers grew numb, muscles trembled from strain, but no one dared complain. Even the slightest misstep might draw the attention of a steward, a butler, or, in the grandest settings, the lord or lady of the house. Among servants, the stories of failure became whispered warnings. One such tale haunted the corridors of Windsor for generations. The fate of a young server known only as Thomas. Chosen for his nimble hands and steady nerves, Thomas served in the main hall, a place where every meal was attended by dozens of noble eyes. The day in question was a feast for foreign diplomats, a display of England's power and grace. The silver shone, candles flickered, and the air was thick with the sense of roasted meats and expensive wine. Thomas, balancing a heavy tray of crystal goblets, made his way to the high table. His left hand, as always, was hidden behind his back, his face blank, his posture perfect. But as he reached to set a goblet before a foreign guest, a sudden jostle from behind, a misstep by a footman, a slip on spilled wine perhaps, sent the glass tumbling. It fell, struck the edge of the table, and shattered into 100 pieces at the feet of a silent, watching king. The hall fell deathly quiet, eyes turned, breaths held. For a heartbeat, Thomas stood frozen, his right hand shaking, his left still pinned behind his back as he had been taught. The chief steward approached, face unreadable, and with a slight gesture signaled Thomas to follow. He was led away through the servants' door, disappearing into the labyrinthine corridors beneath Windsor. He did not return to service that night. The following day his cot in the servants' quarters was empty. His possessions, such as they were, had been removed. Some said he was dismissed and sent back to his village in shame. Others, more darkly, whispered of secret punishments or a lifetime of blacklisting from any noble household. To the outside world, this seemed a small thing, a broken glass, a vanished servant. But among those who worked in service, it was a lesson passed down with a chill. Mistakes were not forgiven, and discipline was the price of survival. The rules endured for generations. Young servants learned early to suppress the instinct to steady a tray or catch a falling object with both hands. Some practiced late at night, balancing weights on the backs of their hands or tying their left arm behind them to train their bodies in the posture expected at table. Repetition became habit, and habit became second nature, a physical manifestation of obedience and submission. These customs filtered down into the broader culture of service. In lesser houses, the rule persisted, not just as a mark of training, but as a sign of status. Only those who had served in the great halls, who could manage their duties with a single hand, could claim the highest posts in a new household. It became a badge of honor. If you could serve a table with one hand, you had proven yourself worthy of trust, skill, and perhaps a small measure of respect. But the cost was real. Servants developed chronic pain, frozen shoulders, twisted spines, and aching joints from years of forced posture. The mental strain was as punishing as the physical, each meal a test of memory, focus, and fear. Some cracked under the pressure. Others simply faded away, replaced by a new crop of hopefuls, eager for the wages and room that life in service could provide. Today, the ritual survives only in the echoes of formal banquets and the training of a dwindling few, but the legacy remains. Every time a glass is filled with precision, every time a plate is set down without a sound, it is a nod to the centuries of discipline and sacrifice that define the world of service. And the memory of those who disappeared for a single slip, like Thomas of Windsor, endures in the cautionary tales whispered in the kitchens of England, a reminder that perfection was not just expected, but demanded, and that for those who served, even the position of a hand could decide a fate. So the next time you see a waiter, a butler, or a servant move with quiet grace, remember the centuries of training, the stories of fear and pride, and the invisible weight carried in a single hidden hand. Behind every flawless gesture is a world of discipline, sometimes beautiful, often cruel, and always, always remembered. No personal items in view. In the echoing chambers and candlelit corridors of the great houses of Europe, power was measured not only in land or gold, but in the strictest control of every detail of daily life. For those born into service, the rules of the household ran deeper than the stone walls, etched into habits, postures, and silences. Among these rules, one was both petty and devastating. No personal items in view. No tokens, no books, no charms, nothing of your own allowed to exist where a noble's eye might land. The order was as much about erasing identity as about maintaining decorum, and for countless servants, it was a daily battle against invisibility, one lost trinket at a time. To the masters and mistresses, the rule was simple practicality. The home, after all, was their domain, a place of order and display. The sight of a servant's keepsake, a wooden toy, a pressed flower, a cheap ring, was an unwelcome intrusion of other lives, other loves, into a space meant only for their own comfort and reputation. It was believed that the presence of such objects would tarnish the image of wealth and taste, disturb the carefully curated illusion of effortless grandeur. A servant was not supposed to have a life, only a role, a moving shadow at the edge of vision, ready to serve and never to belong. For the servants themselves, this rule was both wound and insult. Most came to service with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the smallest, most precious tokens of home: a mother's brooch, a dog-eared prayer book, a lucky coin. These objects were not luxuries. They were anchors, threads tying a lonely child or weary woman to the world they'd lost. To forbid them was to declare that even the smallest comfort was too much, that even the memory of love must be hidden away. Yet the rule was enforced with chilling vigilance. Senior staff patrolled the servants' quarters, eyes sharp for any sign of forbidden possessions. Beds were searched, lockers upended, pockets emptied with cold efficiency. If a personal item was found, it was confiscated. Sometimes destroyed, sometimes held as leverage, a silent threat. The excuse was always the same: order, discipline, the dignity of the house. But every servant knew the truth. It was about control, about making sure that nothing existed in those halls but the master's will. The punishments ranged from a stern rebuke to instant dismissal. In one famous case, still whispered about in kitchens centuries later, a young page was caught with a simple carved whistle, no more than a scrap of wood, shaped by his father before he'd left the village. He'd hidden it under his cloak, touching it only at night, in the desperate hope that the sound might recall a gentler world. When it was discovered, the butler's face grew dark. The whistle was snapped in half before the boy's eyes, and he was sent away without reference, condemned to wander the roads with nothing but the memory of what he'd lost. Other stories were quieter. Servants who learned to hollow out the hems of their uniforms, to stitch tokens into the lining of their caps, to bury treasures in the garden or behind loose bricks in the cellar. These acts of rebellion were dangerous, but they were also essential. To keep a piece of yourself hidden was to resist the slow erasure of spirit, the grinding down of hope that defined a life in service. Sometimes, a servant might risk all for a single page torn from a favorite book, a note from home, a worn charm against bad luck. In the face of such rules, even the smallest secret could feel like an act of heroism, but the fear was real. To be found out was to risk not only your job, but your very future. A servant dismissed for breaking the rules found every door closed to them. The world outside the manor was cold and unforgiving, and the loss of a place meant the loss of shelter, food, and the fragile community of the servants' hall. Some never recovered. Yet for many, the need for something personal, something that said, "I am more than what I am forced to be," outweighed even the threat of ruin. In rare moments, compassion flickered at the edges of power. A kind mistress might turn a blind eye to a locket or a letter. An aging butler might help a maid hide her treasures out of sight. These were exceptions, not the rule. The system itself demanded erasure, invisibility, the subjugation of all individuality to the demands of the household. The loss of personal items was the loss of self, a wound that never fully healed. Today, the great houses stand as museums and monuments, their strict codes faded into distant memory, but the stories of those who served, of what they cherished, and what they risked to keep it, endure in the cracks of old floorboards, in the hidden cubbyholes where tokens were once tucked away. The carved whistle, the prayer book, the pressed flower. These were never just possessions. They were proof that even in the most controlled, most oppressive spaces, the human spirit clings fiercely to identity, to memory, to hope. No personal items in view. That was the rule. But every rule is an invitation for resistance. And in the quiet rebellion of a hidden trinket, the truth survived. No matter how hard the world tries to erase you, you are never truly invisible. Not to yourself, and not to history. Don't be too clean or too dirty. Imagine waking before dawn in a chilly attic room, dressing in silence, the day's burdens already pressing on your shoulders. You're a servant in a great house, one of many, but always watched, always judged. In this world, your worth is measured not only by how well you sweep a floor or polish a silver goblet, but by how you look while you do it. Not too clean, or you'll be scorned for vanity. Not too dirty, or you'll be mocked for sloth. The line is razor thin, and stepping wrong brings consequences sharper than a scolding. The aristocratic households of England, France, and beyond were built on contradiction. Nobles demanded spotless halls, shining floors, and the gleam of endless labor. Yet those who performed that labor, the silent army below stairs, were forbidden from appearing too spotless themselves. For a servant to show up at roll call with fresh-pressed linen, neat hair, and polished boots risked being branded a show-off. Too clean for your own good, some sneered. Nobles might joke about uppity staff, suspecting a servant who cared too much about appearances of having ambitions beyond their station. At the other end of the spectrum, the servant who arrived with muddy hems, rough hands unwashed, hair unkempt, or nails blackened with soot, was just as quickly shamed, if not outright punished. The message was clear. Your dirt was not to touch their world. To be too clean was to aspire above your place. To be too dirty was to insult the very house you served. The most perilous moment was morning assembly, when housekeepers or butlers inspected the staff. One glance could seal your fate for the day. A housemaid whose apron gleamed whiter than the mistress's might face a snide remark. Who are you trying to impress? A stable boy with fresh soap on his cheeks risked accusations of idleness. Time spent washing was time stolen from the horses. Yet the scullery maid with grease on her sleeves, or the footman whose collar showed a hint of dust, could expect harsher words, public ridicule, or the loss of an evening's meal. This double bind was not just a quirk of etiquette, it was a system of control. Servants were expected to embody humility, hard-working, invisible, and content with little. Nobles policed the boundaries not just of dirt and cleanliness, but of aspiration and despair. A servant who was too clean might be angling for a better post, or worse, catching the eye of someone above their station. A servant who was too dirty was a living rebuke to the household's ideals of order and grace. The result was a daily dance, a choreography of grooming, restraint, and calculated imperfection. Many servants learned to rough up their appearance just enough, a smudge of soot here, a loosened kerchief there. Some scrubbed hands raw at the pump, but left a trace of dust on their boots for good measure. The truly skilled could read a master's mood, knowing when to shine and when to dull their own light, when to risk a clean face and when to hide it behind honest grime. But the scrutiny did not end with the nobility. Servants policed each other just as fiercely. Too much cleanliness invited jealousy and gossip. "Think she's better than the rest of us," they'd mutter about a kitchen maid with clean fingernails. Too much dirtiness, on the other hand, was a sign of laziness, a threat to the team's reputation. Peer pressure, laughter, even exclusion were tools used to enforce this unwritten code. Surviving in this world meant cultivating an uneasy anonymity, a state of being visible only when needed, yet never so visible that you invited trouble. Diaries and letters from the era hint at the mental toll. One footman wrote, "I polish the silver until I see my face, then I hope no one sees mine." A housemaid confessed to crying alone after being scolded for both a spotless cap and, the next week, a speck of ash on her cuff. Some servants carried combs and brushes in secret, tidying up only when alone, fearful even of their own reflection. Yet for all the anxiety, there was dignity in finding balance. The best servants became artists of adaptation, masters of fitting in without fading away. They found pride in a crisp collar that did not dazzle, in hands that were strong but never soft. They formed bonds with others who understood the subtle game, sharing tips for blending in, for walking the line between scorn and approval. In the end, this tension between dirt and polish, shame and pride, revealed the true architecture of the servant's world. It was a place where every glance could wound, where survival depended not just on skill or effort, but on a never-ending negotiation with expectation and fear. The clothes you wore, the soap you used, even the way you folded a cloth or entered a room, became acts of calculation, tiny rebellions, or careful surrender. So, next time you step through the doors of an old estate or read the letters of those who served, remember the invisible battles fought on the surface of skin and cloth, the stories of those who were never allowed to be simply themselves, never too clean, never too dirty, always balancing on the edge of someone else's approval. Their struggles are woven into the very fabric of history, as real and enduring as the dust on a servant's sleeve, or the quiet pride behind a servant's steady gaze. Never ask a question. There are silences that speak louder than words, silences that fill the corridors of old houses, pressing down on those who serve, warning them that even a single question could be a step too far. In the great estates of the past, hierarchy was law, and obedience was the air the lower orders breathed. To ask a question, even out of genuine confusion or concern, was to risk being branded not just insolent, but dangerous. For in this world, curiosity was not a virtue. It was an act of rebellion. It is difficult now to imagine a world so tightly bound by rules that a single word, why, could change a life. But for generations of servants, apprentices, and laborers, the rule was clear: never ask. Schedules, mealtimes, changes in duty, these were dictated from above, delivered as commands, never to be questioned. To do so was to betray an independent mind, a challenge to the natural order. Curiosity belonged to your betters. Your role was to listen, obey, and remain invisible. Consider the story of Elsie, a young maid in a bustling country manor. She had grown up watching her mother bend beneath the weight of service, learning early that silence was safer than speech. The rhythm of the household was a music she moved to instinctively, rising before the sun, rushing to polish boots and fill lamps, carrying trays with the grace of a dancer, always 3 steps behind her mistress. Elsie was diligent, clever, and, dangerously, curious. One morning, after a restless night when a guest had arrived late and supper had stretched until nearly midnight, Elsie found herself confused. The schedule she memorized no longer seemed to apply. Were breakfast trays to be sent early as on normal days, or delayed for the sake of rest? The housekeeper was nowhere to be found, and the cook was in a foul mood, snapping at everyone who passed. After minutes of anxious waiting, Elsie gathered her courage and approached the under-butler, a man famous for his devotion to rules. In a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Excuse me, sir, should we serve at 7 as usual or wait for the bell?" The under-butler stared at her as though she had spoken in a foreign tongue. The room fell silent. All eyes shifted to Elsie. The under-butler's lips curled in disdain. "You presume to ask questions?" he barked. "You are not here to think. You are here to do as you are told. Elsie tried to explain her confusion, hoping for understanding, but the line had already been crossed. The cook muttered, "Impertinent little thing." The underbutler's anger grew. He delivered the ultimate censure, striking her sharply across the cheek and calling her impertinent. Elsie's skin burned, but the shame ran deeper. She was ordered from the room, her reputation instantly tarnished. For the rest of the week, she was assigned to the worst duties, scrubbing the scullery floor, cleaning chamber pots, and working alone in the freezing laundry. No one spoke to her except to give commands. The message was clear to every servant in the house. Questions are dangerous, and curiosity will be punished. For Elsie, the lesson was etched in pain and silence. This experience was not unique. Manuals of household management from the period were filled with warnings about the inquisitive servant, the one who asked too many questions, who wondered why duties changed or rules seemed arbitrary. To the masters and mistresses, these questions were more than annoyances. They were threats to authority. Impertinence was the charge, and it could mean dismissal, a bad reference, or, if the question was sharp enough, a beating. Why was curiosity so feared? In part, it was about control. In a world where power was absolute, to question was to claim a voice. Even the simplest inquiry, "Why must we do it this way?" could be heard as a challenge to centuries of tradition. If one servant began to ask, others might follow, and soon the boundaries between master and servant would blur. Better, then, to stamp out the habit before it took root. There was also a profound psychological element. Many in the ruling class saw themselves as guardians of order, convinced that questioning from below was the first sign of anarchy. To maintain the illusion of effortless command, they needed obedience to be unquestioning. Every command followed, every word accepted, no matter how arbitrary or contradictory. But for those who lived under this rule, the cost was enormous. Suppressed curiosity meant suppressed intelligence, stifled initiative, and lives lived in constant fear of making a mistake. It bred anxiety, resentment, and sometimes quiet rebellion. Servants like Elsie learned to trade silence for survival, but never lost the urge to understand, to know the world beyond their narrow tasks. Yet, even in these oppressive conditions, some found ways to keep their curiosity alive. Late at night, in the cramped attic rooms where servants slept, questions flowed freely. Why does the mistress fear the dark? What is the master hiding in his study? Why must we scrub the same floor twice? In these whispered conversations, servants reclaimed a sliver of their humanity, proving that, no matter how hard the world tried to silence them, the desire to know could never be fully extinguished. Historians find traces of this tension in diaries, letters, and court cases, records of servants dismissed for questioning, tales of apprentices punished for asking why a rule existed. The fear of impertinence shaped more than just households. It shaped the emotional landscape of entire societies, teaching generation after generation to accept, to endure, and above all, to keep their questions hidden. Today, the strict hierarchies of the past have faded, but the echoes remain. In every workplace or classroom where questions are discouraged, in every system that values obedience over understanding, the old rule lingers. Never ask why. The story of Elsie and the countless others like her reminds us that the freedom to question is not just a privilege, it is a right hard-won and too easily lost. So the next time you hesitate to ask, remember the maid who was struck for a single word. Remember the power that lives in every question, and the quiet courage it takes to demand an answer. For in the end, progress is not made by those who obey in silence, but by those who dare, again and again, to ask why. Know every bell sound by heart equal sign. In the great houses of old Europe, where power flowed not only from gold and titles, but from the smallest gestures of discipline and deference, there was a secret language that ruled the rhythm of every day, the language of the bells. It was a code every servant was expected to master, a world of sound woven into stone walls, echoing down staircases, carrying orders, warnings, and expectations with every sharp note or lingering peal. To know every bell sound by heart was not simply a skill. It was a condition of survival, a test that began at dawn and ended only when sleep claimed the exhausted mind. The bell system, elegant in its efficiency and terrifying in its implications, defined the tempo of noble life for centuries. Installed in palaces, manors, and townhouses from the late 18th century onward, a web of wires snaked behind wainscoting, connecting drawing rooms, studies, kitchens, parlors, and bedrooms to the hidden world below stairs. Each room had its own bell, each bell a distinct note or timbre, each command a different demand. Sometimes, the bells were labeled in the servants' hall, but more often, they were not, leaving it to the staff to learn the language the hard way, through repetition, memory, and the ever-present threat of punishment. For the servants, the bells were both a summons and a sword. The ringing might start as early as 5 in the morning, a crisp, single chime from the master's room for hot water, or a frantic double peal from the nursery if a child had fallen ill. A sharp, rapid succession meant, "Come at once!" A slow, deliberate toll signaled dinner, tea, or the arrival of visitors. At midday, a particular bell might call the butler to the dining hall, while another, softer tone would send a scullery maid running to clear the kitchen. There was a bell for every occasion: fire, emergencies, lost keys, unexpected callers, and even in the most refined homes, a bell for summoning the family dog. To an outsider, the sounds might have blended into chaos, but to a trained servant, every note had meaning. From their first day, new staff were drilled to recognize each bell's unique pitch and rhythm. Elder maids and butlers would test the newcomers. Is that the breakfast room or the green parlor? Was that 3 quick rings or 2 slow ones? The wrong answer could mean humiliation or worse. In some houses, the penalty for confusing a dinner bell with a visitor alert was a public scolding or a pay cut. In stricter homes, a missed command brought the crack of the cane or a week spent doing the filthiest chores. The pressure was relentless. Imagine yourself in the heat of the kitchen, sleeves rolled, hands deep in soapy water, when a bell sounds, a single short ring. Instantly you freeze. Was that the master's study or the mistress's bedroom? The wrong guess, the wrong step, and you could ruin a dinner party, leave a guest unattended, or enrage the household's matron. For the servant, the cost of a single mistake could echo for weeks. A stain on one's record, a story retold by the staff, a reputation that followed you from house to house. Sometimes the bells would ring in concert, a cacophony of demands. On grand occasions, a ball, a wedding, a state visit, the staff might hear bells from every corner of the house. Feet pounded on stairs, voices whispered in panic, the air charged with the anxiety of missing the signal that mattered most. Even when the house was quiet, the bells haunted every moment. Some servants reported hearing phantom chimes in their sleep, their dreams invaded by the ceaseless demands of the household. Reported hearing phantom chimes in their sleep, their dreams invaded by the ceaseless demands of the household. And yet, there was a kind of pride in this mastery. To know the bells by heart was to be trusted, to move with assurance and grace through the rituals of service. The most respected butlers and housekeepers could distinguish the difference between the faint ring of the back parlor and the urgent clang of the main entrance. They moved with the confidence of conductors, orchestrating the unseen symphony of labor that kept the household running. But the system was also a tool of power, a reminder that the servant's life was not their own. The bells could summon at any hour, for any reason, with no right of refusal. A lord in a foul mood might ring repeatedly, simply to test the staff's obedience, while a lady might summon a maid just to ask for a misplaced ribbon. Every ring was a reminder. You are always being watched, always being tested, always just one mistake away from punishment or dismissal. Some of the cruelties inflicted for bell errors were infamous. There are records of maids who, after misreading a bell, were forced to scrub floors until their knees bled, or to go without supper for days. Footmen caught responding too slowly were made to stand for hours in the drafty hall as an example to others. In the worst cases, wages were docked, references withheld, and futures destroyed over the simple, split-second confusion of one bell with another. And yet, even in this world of anxiety and hierarchy, there were moments of humanity. Veteran servants took pity on the newest recruits, covering for missed calls or slipping them hints in the frantic moments before a dinner. Quiet alliances formed in the servants' hall, shared glances, coded signals, the silent camaraderie of those who lived at the mercy of the bells. With the coming of the 20th century, the world of bells began to fade. Electric buzzers replaced clanging wires, telephones replaced calls, and the great armies of servants dwindled to a precious few. But in the old houses that still stand, some of those bells remain. If you wander their halls, you may still see the faded wires and tarnished brass, reminders of a vanished world, where every sound meant something and every moment was a test. To know every bell sound by heart was to survive, to serve, and sometimes to rebel in tiny ways, resisting the tyranny of the master's command by sharing a secret smile, a comforting word, or a moment of solidarity in the servants' hall. For those who lived by the bells, the memory never faded. Even years later, long after leaving service, some swore they could still hear the old signals in the back of their mind. A sharp ring, a slow toll, the call to duty that shaped their days and haunted their dreams. In the world of the bells, there was no room for error and little time for rest. The rules were clear, the consequences harsh, and the lessons lifelong. But in that world, too, there were stories of resilience, courage, and endurance, testaments to the human spirit's refusal to be broken, even in the face of unending summons. And so, the bells have fallen silent, but their echoes remain, a haunting reminder of a world where every note was both a command and a challenge, a test of memory and nerve, and a daily battle to be heard and remembered. Don't show pain. There are moments in history when silence was not just golden, it was a matter of survival. In the hidden world beneath the grandeur of manor houses and stately homes, servants lived by codes far stricter than any book of etiquette could record. To survive as a servant, especially in the lowest and most perilous roles, meant more than hard work. It meant knowing when to vanish, when to bow, and, above all, when to swallow every cry of pain, no matter how sharp or sudden. In the stables, where the world's powerful met its most unpredictable force, horses, this lesson was carved into the bones of every boy who dared to serve. The life of a stable boy was harsh from the first breath of dawn. Before the lords and ladies even stirred, the stables thudded with life. Snorts, stamping hooves, the smell of hay, sweat, and manure. Boys as young as 8 or 9 were set to their tasks, mucking out stalls, brushing down the heavy bodies of draft horses, carrying buckets almost as large as themselves. They learned quickly that every animal had a temperament, that even the gentlest mare could lash out in a heartbeat, and that the slightest mistake, a dropped bucket, a poorly fastened girth, a moment's distraction, could provoke disaster. For one boy, the lesson came hard. He was new to the household, thin and quiet, hands chapped and raw from a winter's worth of labor. That morning, he was leading a young stallion from its stall, guiding it gently with voice and hand. But the animal spooked, perhaps by a sharp sound or the scent of another horse, and lashed out, hind hoof flashing faster than thought. The blow caught the boy in the ribs, lifted him from his feet, and sent him crashing to the straw. In that split second, instinct screamed for him to wail, to curl up, to sob for help. But a deeper instinct, one drilled into him from the first day, held him rigid and silent. He did not cry out. He did not call for the stable master. Instead, he pressed his lips together, drew a ragged, trembling breath, and slowly, painfully pulled himself upright. Every movement burned, and his vision swam with stars. But still, not a sound escaped his throat. Why such silence? It was not bravery, at least not in the way stories are told of knights and heroes. For servants, pain was not a tale to be admired, but a weakness to be hidden. To cry out was to draw attention, and attention was dangerous. It marked you as clumsy, unfit, a troublemaker. It risked the wrath of a master who saw any disruption as an affront to order, or worse, an excuse to dismiss you in disgrace. Some households even had written rules. Any servant caught making a scene would be beaten, fined, or sent packing. The unwritten rule was harsher still. Pain is to be swallowed, endured, erased from the world as quickly as possible. Those who could not manage it soon disappeared from service. Those who did learned to wear a mask so convincing it seemed to swallow their very selves. A limp was explained as old shoes. A bruised cheek was hidden beneath a cap. Broken fingers were taped and ignored. All the while, work continued. Horses fed, stalls cleaned, bridles polished, no matter what injuries a servant carried inside. This culture of silence had deep roots. The hierarchy of the estate was absolute. At the top, the master and mistress; below, a strict ladder of stewards, butlers, grooms, cooks, maids, and boys. Each rung depended on obedience, invisibility, and the suppression of anything that might upset the fragile order of the household. Pain was just one more secret kept behind closed doors. In the stables, the price of breaking this code could be instant and public. To make a sound when kicked, to let the master see a tear, was to risk being dismissed as weak or untrustworthy, no matter how severe the injury. Stable masters, themselves hardened by years of service, would offer no sympathy. Instead, they demanded the boy return to work at once, brushing away blood or limping on a sprained ankle, pretending nothing had happened. Sometimes, older grooms might slip a boy a crust of bread or show him how to bind a wound out of sight, but never, ever in the presence of superiors. The consequences were brutal. Medical records from the period, when they exist, tell of young servants with untreated fractures, persistent infections, chronic pain. Some never healed properly. Many developed lifelong disabilities, but still hid their suffering, hoping to cling to the little security service offered. The alternative was hunger, homelessness, or the workhouse, fates that made silence seem a small price to pay. And yet, in the long, silent hours of work, servants forged their own quiet bonds. They became experts in reading the pain in each other's eyes, a slight hitch in the gait, a wince quickly masked, the subtle way one hand cradled a bruised side. In these moments, a brief glance, a pat on the shoulder, or a shared nod meant more than 100 words. Compassion moved in the spaces where sound could not. Outside the walls, the world rarely saw this. Visitors marveled at the smooth running of the estate, the polished horses, the neat uniforms of the stable staff. They never guessed at the pain beneath the surface, or the iron discipline required to maintain such calm in the face of injury and fear. For the boy who was kicked that winter morning, the mark faded with time. He told no one of the broken rib, the sleepless nights spent struggling to breathe, the lingering ache that surfaced whenever he lifted a saddle. But he kept his place, and in doing so, preserved the only future available to him. He was not alone. Across generations, across countries, thousands of others endured their own blows, their own moments of pain and silence, in service to a world that demanded not only their labor, but their very ability to suffer unseen. This legacy survives, if only in the faint traces left behind: worn tools, hospital records, faded diaries. The world has changed, but the lesson remains. Sometimes, the greatest courage is not in what is shouted, but in what is endured without a sound. The servant's silence was more than obedience. It was a shield, a language, a testament to the strength it took to survive in a world that valued order above mercy and demanded that even the deepest pain pass unseen. So next time you hear the quiet of a stable, imagine the stories hidden in that silence, the bravery not of battle, but of simply holding back a cry and carrying on. In that hush, history still lingers, and the strength of those who learned not to show pain echoes softly, even now. Loyalty to the grave. In the world of the great estates, where secrets could be more valuable than gold, and reputation was guarded with an iron will, there was a law every servant learned by heart, though no parchment ever recorded it: loyalty to the grave. It was a code as old as the stone walls themselves, woven through every whispered command, every nod in the corridor, every silent glance exchanged between those who served and those who ruled. Even after the last candle had been snuffed out and a servant was turned away from the door, what they had seen and heard was expected to remain locked behind their lips until their dying day. For most, this law was simply survival. Inside the manor, the boundaries were clear. Your life belonged to the household, your eyes and ears instruments of service, your thoughts and memories the property of your employer. But what lingered in the minds of countless servants was the chilling knowledge that dismissal did not end the contract. It was understood that the penalty for loose talk could be as swift and brutal as anything meted out within those walls. The rules were made clear in subtle ways: warnings whispered by elder housemaids to new girls in the laundry room, the scowl of a butler when gossip was caught flickering at the dinner table, the icy smile of a lady's maid who had seen too much and spoken too little. Even the rare moment of dismissal, a bitter departure after years of faithful service, came with a final, unspoken order: forget what you saw, bury what you know, or risk the consequences. Most heeded the warning, vanishing quietly into the anonymity of the servants' road, carrying their knowledge like a secret brand. Some found work in distant counties, never daring to speak the names of their former masters. But every now and then, one would falter, a moment of indiscretion. a careless word in a tavern, a story told for a mug of ale. And sometimes, the price paid was far worse than mere unemployment. The story of the dismissed cook is one that rippled through the servant class for generations. He was a broad-shouldered, good-natured man, known for his laugh and his talent with a Sunday roast. But as with so many, his fate turned on a moment. The master's household was rocked by a scandal, a secret affair between the lady of the house and a visiting noble. The cook, always invisible but always present, overheard more than was wise. Perhaps he was careless, or perhaps he thought, in his bitterness after dismissal, that a bit of gossip could buy him sympathy among his fellows. It began with a whisper, words traded in the low light of a public house, laughter that was too loud, eyes that were too eager to hear tales of the mighty brought low. He told of the midnight meetings, the coded notes, the trembling hands and stolen kisses. The scandal spread quickly, growing with every retelling until it reached the wrong ears. The cook, flush with drink and a rare sense of power, did not see the shadows gathering. Weeks later, he was found in a ditch outside the village, cold and still, his laughter silenced for good. The official verdict was misadventure, a drunken fall on a rainy night. But among the servants, there was no doubt. His death was a warning, a brutal reminder that loyalty was not a matter of choice, but of survival, enforced not by law, but by fear. The message was understood by all who heard it. What happens behind the manor walls stays there, or the price may be paid in blood. This was not an isolated story. There were countless others. Housemaids who vanished after a careless remark, stable boys found on the road after betraying a confidence, footmen dismissed and never seen again. Some say there was an unspoken network of informers, ready to report any servant who broke the sacred trust. Others claimed the nobility themselves took direct action, unwilling to risk the ruin that a single word could bring. Yet for every tragedy, there were those who managed to keep their silence, building new lives on a foundation of secrets. It was said that the best servants, those who kept their heads down and their mouths shut, could find work anywhere, their loyalty as valuable as their skill. But the cost was high. Years of stories untold, memories swallowed, the burden of knowledge carried alone to the grave. In this world, gossip was more than idle talk. It was a weapon, a currency, a potential act of treason. The pressure to keep silent shaped every relationship, every conversation, every moment of intimacy or trust. The weight of what could not be spoken pressed down on servants and masters alike, building a world where truth was always shadowed by fear. Today, the great houses stand as relics, their secrets faded, their dangers gone, but the stories remain, in the echoes of old kitchens, in the nervous laughter of tour guides, in the eyes of the portraits that line the walls. Loyalty to the grave. It was not just a rule, but a sentence, a chain that bound even the freest of spirits, and for those who dared to break it, the price could be everything. The cook in the ditch is gone, his story told and retold, a ghost among the hedgerows and hearths. But his fate lingers, a last warning from a world where silence was both shield and shackle, where the cost of disloyalty could follow you long after your service was done, and where some secrets, once learned, could only ever be buried with the dead.